Hey everybody, welcome in that new video which explain how does terrain work at layout and rendering steps. This is a question we get pretty often in support, so I decided to provide more details about what's the underlying mechanism here. So when you do a simulation, most of the time you end up by defining some geometry you want your characters to be adapted on, and you create a terrain node. That terrain node can be created from the NavMesh creator if you want to create some obstacles. If you don't really care about obstacles, you can just select your geometry, create a terrain node. And you can see that within that terrain node, we record what will be the geometry or the transform you'd like the characters to adapt on that. So when you run the simulation, the characters get adapted to the terrain they get assigned with. You can have multiple terrain if you want to. And when we do export the simulation, that terrain geometry gets also exported with the simulation caches. The reason we need to export that terrain is that if you apply some layout modification, let's say in post-sim process, you take that character, you move it away, we need to have the data about where is that terrain, because all that processing is not going to be computed within Maya anymore. It's going to happen, it's its own workflow, and also at rendering time we also need to know where the character is compared to the terrain. So if we move that character away, let's say here and here there's a bump in the original terrain, we'd like the process to know about it, so we need to export that terrain. That data here is stored in what we call the source terrain. So when you export your simulation, you end up with a simulation cache proxy, and within the simulation cache proxy you can see that you've got the terrain attributes, and within the terrain attribute there's a file extension is GTG Golaem terrain geometry, and it's a predefined name here. It gets stored in the same directory than your simulation caches. It takes the name of the scene, the name of the crowd field it's related to, .terrain.gtg. So it's kind of fixed, right? And if you need to have a new terrain and layout, you can just add it into the destination terrain. But let me talk about that a bit later. So just to check that I'm actually using the right terrain here, is that I can draw the terrain. You can see it's kind of blocked. Reason it's blocked because most of those attributes are actually connected to the proxy manager, which is just a node which can handle all the simulation cache proxies in your scene. Rather than going into every single cache proxy and changing the options, you can use the proxy manager to define shared attributes. If you're not happy with that, you can just break the connection here and control those attributes separately. But from the proxy manager here, I can draw the terrain and I can see what's the currently used terrain I'm having, which is the one I've used into the simulation, which is correct now. Great. So let's say for some reason the simulation terrain changed, and now this is your simulation terrain. So sure, your simulation cache is not in sync with that. You can either decide to use that source terrain as a destination terrain at layout step, and it means that now your characters in layout will be adapted to that new terrain. That's one option. But you can also maybe create another terrain from that geo, assign that new terrain to your simulation maybe, and the next time you're gonna run the sim, export the sim, the characters will adapt to that new geometry terrain. So okay, great, that's exactly what's expected. And let's export that scene simulation. Let's say we're really happy with that simulation, and let's run this for a couple of frames. Great. And now we'll go back into cache proxy mode, cache replay mode. What about now? So let me hide those geometries there. So this is my characters get adapted from the simulation on that terrain. What about what's gonna be used in layout? And this is one of the issue here. The thing is, the terrain, it's kind of performance intensive. It takes some computation power to export some geometry. Here my geometry is pretty simple, but sometimes we end up with terrain which are really expensive, and we don't want to update and re-export the terrain geometry every single time we export a simulation cache. So the terrain is only exported if it doesn't exist. If that GTG file doesn't exist in the same directory than the simulation cache file, your terrain will not be exported even if it has changed, even if the geometry has changed, even if the terrain which is used has changed, it will not be re-exported anymore. So how do you fix this? Because one problem here now is if you move your characters, let's do the experience, the terrain there, if you move a character with a layout step, and I'm having a layout modification here. If I move the characters here, you can see they're not adapted to the terrain. And the reason for that is because the terrain they think they're working on is that one here. And for them, that terrain don't change in really, it doesn't have any bump. So when we move the character, we'll take a look at, we were here before, we're here now. What's the difference between that 8 and that 8? It's 0. So it's not the right value we want to have here. And now the characters are either flying above the ground or going through that geo. So one way to fix this is to change the source terrain. Specify that this is the terrain which has been used for the simulation. Put those two in sync. So to do that, I can go into the cache proxy manager, and from 7.3.5 there's a new button called export source terrains. So for every single cache proxy, it will take a look at what's the terrain node which is connected to those guys, and we're gonna export that geo. Or you can go into your cache proxy, each and single of the cache proxy, and press that source terrain button. Let's use that one here. And you can see that as soon as I used that one, it changed what was happening during the simulation. Now the draw is aligned with what I had, and now my characters are correctly adapt to that situation here, even if we've been applying some layout modification. That was the original simulation, and as soon as we apply or translate, you can see the characters properly gets adapted. That's great. So let's remove that draw. So now the characters are correctly fixed. So what about the destination terrain? Let's say the simulation terrain is going to be this one here. You've been computed your simulation on that complete environment. And let's say you change your mind once again, and now the terrain has to be that terrain there. So let's hide my source terrain here. So sure, what I can do is still re-export the simulation, but sometimes maybe it's not convenient to re-export the simulation. So maybe sometime you want to use a destination terrain which will be applied only at layout. So the way you do that is you select your terrain, you go into the cache proxy, and you're gonna write down your destination terrain. Destination terrain is gonna be another geometry that you'll be able to use only once the simulation has been exported, which will be applied only at layout. So once again, that attribute here is actually connected to the proxy. So if I wanted to set it from the proxy, I need to break the connection first. Or what I can do is maybe use the proxy, and the proxy will, the manager, and the manager will, spread that data in all cache proxy that I'm having. So I can select my actual geometry and say this is what I want to use as a destination terrain. Now I can define what name I want to use. So I'm gonna say this is gonna be terrains new geo, and save it like this. And now you can see that within the proxy manager, there's a destination terrain which will be used to readapt the character, and within the cache proxy as well, as it's connected, is going to be used as well. If we draw the terrain now, we've got two data being displayed. The display is not really perfect, but we got the previous terrain here, that what we had before, and we got the destination terrain. So once again, we use those two data to know what's the new 8 we should reproject the character. And obviously, if you need, you can still do some ground adaptation I key, because right now we're just re-snapping the position of the characters. So if we pay attention to the footprints, it's not exactly perfect. If we want to have it exactly perfect, we can apply ground adaptation with I key, with I key layer on top of the layout modifications. So yeah, that's the different definitions of what are the terrain. Always pay attention if you change your simulation terrain and you already exported your simulation once. Really pay attention to that. Make sure that you're always in sync. Else, when you're going to move your characters, you'll have some slight differences depending on what was the previous geometry or the old geometry. So two ways to use that. To do that, either re-export the source terrain using the buttons from the UI, or maybe write down your simulation in a new directory or remove the GTG from the previous directory. Hope that clears things, and probably see you into the next video.